You are listening to the Level Up Your Gaming Podcast, episode 150, a retrospective and look into the future of tabletop RPGs. In today's episode, we celebrate our 150th episode by looking back at the history of tabletop RPGs. We cover the long history of tabletop games through the decades. We also take a look at the future of tabletop games as well. Thank you for listening to the podcast as we hit our 150th episode. If you've been listening since the beginning, throw a like on the podcast or write in. We appreciate all your listeners and look forward to you sticking with us for more of the journey. If you'd like to participate in the discussion or leave us feedback, you can contact us at levelupyourgamingpodcast@gmail.com or find us on Facebook at facebook.com/levelupyourgaming. If you like the content and want to hear more of the show, subscribing will ensure you don't miss an episode. New episodes come out almost every Wednesday. Also, please review, tell a friend about the podcast, or share with your gaming group. Now sit back and enjoy the episode. Welcome into the Level Up Your Gaming Podcast. My name is Aaron, and joining me virtually, I've got Josh. Josh, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. It's spring break here.
Spring break here. That's probably pretty wonderful in some ways and terrible in others.
Well, yeah. I mean, my kids are home, so that's great because I get to see them. But also, it's terrible because they're here, and I still have a job to do most of the time. Yeah, but my mom is taking my wife and the kids out. They're actually heading out to Lake Geneva for the weekend, and I get to spend some time by myself, get to work on my game, maybe get to play a little video games myself. It'll be nice. The reason I'm bringing up Lake Geneva, though, is because it really does tie in quite nicely to what we'd like to talk about today.
Yes. So today is the 150th episode of this podcast. Woo, 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 woo. So Josh, this is your first time joining with the episode, and we try to do something pretty creative for each, 50th episode that we do. And this time we're going to be talking about, perhaps you're going to have a little bit of time to reflect on some things while your wife and kids are gone.
I might.
So today, maybe we can reflect on tabletop RPGs and kind of look at a retrospective on tabletop RPGs, where they came from, and then where they're going and where we think they're going today, based on like differences in the games themselves. And thankfully, Josh is a historian.
I don't know about that.
And he knows all about the inception of all tabletop RPGs going back to 1913.
Yeah. So I went, and we were talking about this as we want to do something special. It's 150th episode. It's a nice time to do something special for our listeners. And I had thought that doing a little retrospective would be a fun and interesting thing to talk about, because we've been talking about, modern games and what we do with modern games and how we can make our games today better, and, how we can have more enjoyment at the table or more interaction at the table. And I kind of wanted to take a look and see historically what other games did, when things were introduced, and maybe see if there's something we could learn from the way that games have been, and, draw inspiration from old systems or how systems were designed to see what we can do to move games forward. And one of the first things I started with was, well, what really is the first tabletop role-playing game? And of course, it's going to be Dungeons and Dragons. And where did that come from? And so, as you do whenever you start, Googling and searching on Wikipedia and checking out people's YouTube channels and doing some internet sleuthing, the rabbit holes go pretty deep.
And Josh realized that he could make a whole different podcast. So this is his last episode with us. He's going to start doing the history of tabletop RPGs. No, I'm just kidding. He's...
No, God, no. That's you could have a whole series on these, because individual games back from these times, they're extensive, interesting rules, interesting sets. how things came about and the history behind some of these things, even like the office politics that were involved in creating some of these games. You can get really in depth with the information that's available. But I want to stick closer to what's useful for us. And so I put together a little list, and I'd like to go through it with y'all.
Okay. So as has been mentioned on this podcast many times, the inception of D&D came from war games. Gary Gygax and his friends there, they all played war games, and that is how D&D came into inception. So obviously that is where the rabbit hole took you, and that's why I said going back to 1913, and even earlier if you want to base it on the game of chess.
Yeah, the earliest record of using miniatures in a war game actually links back to Robert Louis Stevenson, which is, I just thought was crazy. But then the next game, the actual earliest game that is known to have been published, like with actual rules, was a game written by H.G. Wells, like War of the Worlds H.G. Wells, which was Little Wars back in 1913. And then there's like a whole bunch of other games. I found one, I know we had talked about like the murder boxes. I was one of the first podcasts that I was on. We talked about, solving mysteries using physical things. And I would base that off of, picking up those like Hunt a Killers or the murder mysteries and stuff like that. And it turns out those are back from the 1920s with something called Jury Box, that they've been around since that time. But yes, Dungeons and Dragons was a collaboration between Gary Gygax and Jeff Piran. And that was based off of war games, specifically something called Chainmail, which was their own version of something they had seen called Siege of Bodenberg. And they saw that at Gen Con 1. Gen Con 0 was Gary Gygax rented out a hall for like $250, $350, something like that. And like had just war games. It was just like a weekend or a week of war games at this convention hall. And it was up in Lake Geneva. That's where the Gen in Gen Con comes from. Geneva, which I didn't know because it's just been in Indiana as far as I can remember.
The more you know. I thought like it had something to do with like generation or something like that.
Nope. Geneva,
Lake Geneva. Crazy.
Yep. Because the original TSR offices were in Lake Geneva. Yeah. Just like, these are things that I didn't even think about. And they should be obvious to somebody that like pays attention to some of this, but like it hasn't been a thing since the early 80s. So there you go. What do you know about war games, Aaron?
I know that you have your set of miniatures and that you have specific sets of rules for how different ones can move across the field and the types of attack powers and things that you can do against other opponents. And the big one that I'm familiar with is, I know Warhammer is a big one. And my friend Tom, who had also co-hosted some of these episodes with us, he was a big Warhammer guy back in the day, and I saw many iterations of his miniature armies before he finally decided to sell all of them. So
yeah. Warhammer is like the most popular war game right now, and there's different iterations therein. But I was looking at like historically, because tabletop came from war games. See, is a game from 1954 called Tactics. This one actually wasn't just like a rules. Most of them just sent out books. Like we do with a lot of modern tabletop games, is we just get a book of rules and we sort of have to do our own thing. But Tactics was one that also included a board and pieces. And one of the fun parts about it was that it was one of the first ones that introduced a couple of things that we still use today. Specifically, they've got movement costs for different terrain. So if you've got difficult terrain in your games, that came back from 1954, a board game. They've got player turns where they can move and attack in the same turn. And it was those sort of like innovations are that old for those sort of things. I wanted to bring up the Siege of Bodenberg because that was what inspired Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin to come up with chainmail, because it was a lot of the classic war games were modernish, or they were more based in reality. We talk about chess because chess is, still the most popular version of it on the planet. It's been around since forever. And it is very detached from reality. You get pieces that are just shapes. They don't really have unit costs. Everything is,
there are rules based on the shapes, but you don't have anything that
exactly
hinders yourself in terms of the terrain on the board, minus, I guess, their ways that they move. So.
Yeah. None of your pieces have armor. There's no special weapons. No, it's 1-to-1. But Siege of Bodenberg was a medieval combat. And I think this is what really drew a lot of this in. You'd have one player attacking, another player defending. One player played the keep of Bodenberg, and the other team would play the various army units that would be attacking it. It was played at that first Gen Con back in 1968, and they liked it so much they wrote up their own rules and included a supplement with these rules that encouraged you to replay fantasy games, such as battles from Tolkien, Battle of Pelennor Fields, Battle of Helm's Deep, and that sort of thing really interested people. And apparently it became so popular with various other people that Gary Gygax was introduced to somebody playing they had their own long-term story, and they used some of these chainmail rules as a single player game where you could not, instead of controlling an army, you'd be controlling a single unit from that army. And Gary Gygax took it and they worked it out and planned some things. And that's where in 1974, we have the original Dungeons and Dragons.
What's interesting for me is that you mentioned when we met up on the weekend is that it already even played the game because it had all the rules about everything else, but the combat. Yeah. You actually needed the chainmail supplement.
Well, and that's the fun part is those original books, they it was like a 3-book thing. You've got your player stuff, you got your monster stuff, and you got your DM stuff, but the box was big enough to put the chainmail rules in it because you needed to know them to play. That original game you couldn't play without them. But I mean, it was very basic. It only had I think 3 classes: your fighter, your wizard, and your cleric. And they didn't have any sort of parity in terms of leveling. You could play humans, and I think there were some other races you could play, but the other races were level capped or couldn't play certain classes. Dwarves, for example, I think could only play fighters, which in the original system was called fighting men. So, and then even then they could only get up to a certain level where humans could get all the way up to whatever max level for that class was. It was, and I'm reading through these old rules. It's Wild West.
And you didn't know what you were doing at the time.
Well, yeah. And a lot of people, you talk to who have played original Dungeons and Dragons or even AD&D or even Second Ed, you're going to get different experiences from any of these people. You know, you ask, how was your game played? And they're going to have a different experience from everybody else because the rules were very open-ended. This was before that a lot of these play tests went through, before people understood how games were supposed to work, or, you know, what sort of things worked in a game setting. And it was usually left up to the game master to decide what rules, what modifications needed to be put in place to make their game work the best.
It's so interesting that you mentioned that, because it's almost like what we've talked about for 150 episodes on this podcast.
And it started before I was born. Yeah. And I think that, you know, the concept of homebrew and coming up with rules that work best for your table and coming up with these things is not just a new concept. This has been a concept for tabletop RPGs since its inception. This is core to the entire genre. The hobby is based on it, and we should embrace it.
Yes. Again, rules as written is great, but it doesn't fit everything that you want to do. And thankfully you have a, God, what, it's like 50 years old now, almost 50-year-old system in Dungeons and Dragons. In that
Next year, yeah.
Yeah. And that you have so much, you know, history of refining rules. So again, for every homebrew option that was out there, for everybody who tried to take something that, and we're going to talk about this, who tried to take something and do something with what Dungeons and Dragons, I even, you know, started here in that tabletop world, is, you know, gets reinserted back into Dungeons and Dragons. If you're wondering why it's so fleshed out, why there's a rule for like climbing up a mountain when it's nighttime and it's icy, you know, it's because it's been around for almost 50 years.
Yeah.
Somebody had to figure that out.
Like, I knew that Dungeons and Dragons was, you know, this old, but some of the things that they had in the original games, and had never, you know, come back, really interested me. So we talked about the original, you know, 3 books. They did have supplements. Even way back then, you had supplements that were released, both as published material, and then there was additional material that was published in like a newsletter or a magazine that came out from the Strategic Review, which is a publication of TSR, for a little bit of time. And some of these old things, Greyhawk was the original setting. And Greyhawk was a setting that came to them from this other party and became a core setting for the game for years. And I think it came back in 3 as like the core setting before, you know, we go off to Faerun and whatever. But that was where they added the combat rules back into the game, so you'd actually have combat rules. They added, you know, monsters, classes, spells, all sorts of things that we look at today as like, just these are parts of Dungeons and Dragons and have been. And these were a supplement. These were added in after the beginning. Then you have other supplements: Blackmore, Eldritch Wizardry, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. I've heard some people had issues with Eldritch Wizardry because that's where they added like psionics, and for some reason, psionics is a hot button issue when it comes to D&D.
Oh, I've heard many an argument on the hot button issue of psionics. I won't get into it because I don't care very much about it. But if you want to hear some good stuff on it, the Hybrid Theory podcast has a great episode on psionics. So
yeah. And, you know, once again, this is a supplement, and these are optional rules. And that's what I think is really interesting about some of this thing is that we have always had optional rules, things that can be added on, things that are either published or come from third-party sources that we can use to supplement and augment our games. So I think what's important here is, well, what was that early game like? What was D&D like back in the, early mid 70s?
Well, I'm gonna go again. I'm gonna go with what you researched here, Josh. It was a war game. It was still a war game because again, it was born from war games. You don't have as much of the role playing in that earlier piece there, and you were controlling only one character at a time instead of your multiple armies. You talked about this earlier, and you could just die at any time.
Yeah, all those rules about like death saves or like none of that existed. In the original game, you rolled for your starting hit points. So you could end up with a character with 1 hit point. A slight breeze could kill your initial character, and that's it. There was no like zeros or, like any sort of healing stuff to keep somebody from that. But the player characters were basically just grunts from that original chainmail that you got to now make into heroes. They had all sorts of combat encounters that were super, super deadly. Random encounters could be anything. So you could just wander into, a dragon or an army, and that's just what happened. And you had to either run away or figure it out. And yeah, rules were, like I said, they were up to the DM.
Crazy. I mean, just you think about. I mean, again, and this is the first inception of it. But from it bore, the next editions and the and the next inception of it. So again, you got it's split into two camps, and again, the history behind this, I'm sure you will enlighten me here. I know you ended up with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons first ed, and then you ended up with the Dungeons and Dragons. Was it considered 2E or was it still first ed there?
That's Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is generally considered first edition.
Okay.
And then there was a secondary version that came out at the same time called Basic. And Basic was it's like the SRD is now. Okay. It is a lot of the same rules, but it's limited in scope. That Basic set only had the first 3 levels. It was very much an easy way into the game. It didn't have a lot of the expansion. The classic Dungeons and Dragons alignment chart, right? It's got how many squares? 9 squares, right? You got lawful versus evil, good versus evil, lawful versus chaotic. In Basic, they only had 3.
Okay.
It was just
good, bad, and evil, or good, neutral, evil. I'm guessing.
I think it was lawful versus chaotic, actually.
Okay.
And like good and evil were left up to the dungeon master to decide.
Yeah.
So you'd have spells that were like they affect good or evil characters in different ways, and it would be up to your DM to sort of say what that meant. And I thought that was interesting, but this is that's basic D&D. Whereas AD&D was just a cleaned up version of the original Dungeons and Dragons with the supplements added in. And this is where we get our first look at the core books. You had your monster manual, you had your player's handbook, and you had your Dungeon Master Guide. And this is back from 1977.
Crazy.
Yeah. And I think the fun part is, and I looked at a couple of different sources, and they all sort of agreed on this, despite rules still being a little loosey-goosey, AD&D was more defined than the previous version, and definitely more defined than Basic. And the reason this was that way was because they wanted to use this in tournaments. They wanted to have this at a Gen Con, since they owned it, so that they could have actual gameplay that they could show off. And it worked. It started gaining popularity, and popularity grew up and through the 80s. So well-designed system. I think I've actually even played this version, but it's been so long, I wouldn't be able to tell you if I played AD&D or Second Ed at this point.
This is a favorite of a listener of ours, Gary. This is what he plays. He still plays this today. So, I mean, like, again, it truly a testament to it. You came out in 1977, and, you know, there's a lot of people who still play AD&D. Like, there were a lot of supplements built around it too. I know there's a lot of books around it. So they added a lot of rules to this. And it, you know, just to speak to the robustness of a system. And again, even if like the system is loosely defined in some way, you know, if you really want to homebrew something and you are a fan of making your own rules, this is a great place to start. So.
Yeah, I think actually the more loosey-goosey the rules were in the beginning, the better it is for people that want to homebrew. Because to sort of decide, you know, what you want to do with this world. You're not stuck in a specific format, having to follow specific rules because they're not there. And I think what's nice also, I originally tried to format this when I was doing my research by decade, because I thought, hey, it'll be easy. I'll just do each decade. Games don't work that way. Games don't come out, at the beginning of the decade and end at the end of the decade. They're all over the place. So
these other ones that came up right around the same time as the D&D is crazy.
Yeah. So, and while I was looking at this as, the 74, there was a professor in Minnesota who had been writing his own fantasy world, saw Dungeons and Dragons and thought, hey, that's great, and turned his fantasy world into a campaign setting, and TSR published it. And it's called Empire of the Petal Throne. It's apparently still a thing. You can still, there are supplements in that are still out there that are still getting updated. There's other fantasy games that came out at the same time, Chivalry and Sorcery, which somebody wanted D&D to be more realistic. So they made this, which I thought was crazy because even back then it was very grounded compared to what it is today. But this is the first game that used the term Game Master, GM, back in 1977. You also had RuneQuest, which came out in 1978, which was one of the first ones to use percentile dice for skills. You also had superhero games and sci-fi games. Sci-fi games such as like Traveler's still around. I think 6th Ed is the one that came out in 2015, 2017. It uses a D6 system. Focuses not on leveling up, but actually on achievements. You had like Gamma World, which was Dungeons and Dragons based, but it was a post-apocalyptic sci-fi game. And like I said, superhero, there was a game called Superhero 2044 that was one of the first ones to use a point buy system for character creation, which I think is awesome. And that's back from, like I said, 77.
So again, now you're learning where all your favorite systems came from.
Yeah. I like all these things that I love about indie games or, new games, or even some of the weirder games you find on the internet. They have roots in design and development back from about the same time that Dungeons and Dragons came out. And it was that explosion of interest in the genre that spawned all sorts of new ideas. And so I'm looking at this and like, this is, yes, original rules came from war games that you had, this team versus that team, and, real quick and dirty, roll the dice, me versus you, and we're done. But once it became a I get to be a hero. I get to try a thing. Everybody came up with new ideas. And there was just sort of an explosion of ideas, an exploration of the genre. You know, those war games, like I said, had been realistic. They had been based in modern or, you know, non-fantasy style. And as soon as you broke that mold, then it became, well, anything's available. You can do fantasy, you can do sci-fi, you can do superheroes, you can do horror, you can do whatever. And you saw a lot of different types of rules being created, and very few of them were balanced. Balance was not a thing back then. There was no playtesting. There was just sort of throw things out there and see what works and leave it up to people to make it work. Exactly. And I kind of like that. That's very interesting. And I think that is, well, we'll get into it. That's something that may be lacking nowadays. So we talked about Dungeons and Dragons basic set, right?
Yep.
So basic was, like I said, basic. And TSR thought that it was too simple of a game to sort of port players into a D&D. So instead of just leaving it at basic and pushing them for the more complicated version, they started working on something called the expert set. It was a compendium to the basic. And while basic did 1 to 3, expert did levels 4 to 14 and added a bunch of new stuff. And after that, they came up with companion, which was 15 to 25, master, which was 26 to 36, and then a book that has not been reprinted, as far as I know, called Immortal. And Immortal was, you don't gain more levels after 36, you gain powers because you are now basically a god. And the further into godhood you are, the more invincible and crazy you are. And this whole set was called BECMI, BECMI. And a lot of this is still in play when you talk about old school Renaissance. When they talk about, you know, playing these old school games, the BECMI system is very much in use for that because it is, it's not as specific in the rules as AD&D, but it's got a lot more options, and there's a lot of things you can add in, especially if you go all the way through the Master and Immortal sets. So you can have a real fun time building something out. And there's a lot of history because these games came out between 1983 and 1986. So that's, 40 years of time.
Yeah. No, that's again, it's interesting to see. It's sort of like an infinite power scaling sort of thing. When you hear people talk about having played a character for 20 years, how do you make that interesting? Well, that this is a way to do so.
Yeah. We talk about the 80s, we talk about Dungeons and Dragons Second Ed, but Second Ed didn't come out until 89. So it's almost a 90s game. But I do want to just bring this in at this point because, BECMI ran, sort of in parallel with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. The Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Second Ed was a new version of things. They tried to streamline D&D, but somehow made it bigger. They added more to it. And it took when it came out in 89, you had the player's handbook, you had a dungeon master guide, but the monster manual wasn't a monster manual. It was like a binder of folders that you could add in and change. It wasn't for like a couple of years. It wasn't until the 90s you got an actual printed monster manual, right? With Second Ed, you ended up with specialty books for each of the different classes. There was more optional rules than you could shake a stick at, which is great if you're looking at, deciding what sort of game you want. and deciding, how you want to play things. And if you've got, new games, maybe go back and take a look at some of these optional rules, see if this is something, if there's something in there that strikes your fancy or, sparks an interest. But this is the last of that old school D&D. This is where old school sort of died because TSR sort of died. But that's 90s. We'll talk about that when we get to the 90s.
Yeah, no. Again, there's so many other systems that came out at this time. You get the basic role-playing game from '81. That's where you introduce the 7 core attributes with various percentage dice. Again, think about is this split into 2 separate things? You have RuneQuest, Call of Cthulhu. You got
those were the games where they actually split armor and defense as 2 separate stats. That's when you first saw that. You could dodge or prevent an attack, but if you did get hit, it would be reduced by the amount of armor you had on you, and those armor would then ablate. So I think, back in 1981, having that, and I still see that in new games, that's, Cyberpunk, the game that I'm working on right now, that's a core attribute of this. And that's came back all the way back from one of these original systems, 1981. There's also the hero system. The hero system was one of those ones that was developed for like superheroes. And it was like a generic role-playing system. A lot of the games that came out in the 80s that are still involved today are these real generic role-playing systems. The hero system was another one that used a pool of points that, by stats, skills, abilities. They call them powers, but whatever. And I think what was fun about the hero system was that these powers were generic. You got an ability to shoot a beam of something, and you and the dungeon master, the game master, would sort of think of beforehand, well, what is that beam? What sort of beam do you fire, Aaron?
Laser beam.
Laser beam. Well, I shoot a pudding beam. Okay. And this was something you could sort of work out with your game master and sort of figure out, well, what does this mean? How does this interact with the world? My pudding beam obviously deflects your laser beam, but your laser beam can cook my pudding beam, so it'll smell really bad in here.
And now your pudding beam is curdled.
It's gross. Just gross. Another one back from the 80s, 1986. The classic GURPS, the generic universal role-playing system. I've seen this been used in all sorts of fun games. One of my favorites is Fallout. Tabletop game ran off of GURPS. Great. Something I liked about GURPS from the very beginning was something called the reality check. It encouraged you to step away from the table, step away from the game world, and just think for a second, would this actually work? Would somebody falling from like a 14-story building onto sharp rocks, would they only take 4 dice of damage, or would they just die? And it's just that sort of thing that it's not for every game. A fantasy game, a specialty superhero game, stuff like that. Yeah, you know what? Ignore reality. But sometimes taking a step back and thinking, well, how does this actually work? How does this actually exist in my world is a very useful thing to think about. Another one that came out back in the 80s was the Megaversal system. Now, I didn't recognize this name until I saw that it's actually also sometimes called the Palladium system, which I have played.
This is what I know these games. This is where I started.
I'm like, Megaversal system, but it's listed on a bunch of games that I played. I haven't played the Megaversal system. No, it's Palladium. It's Palladium. That's the publisher. The publisher is Palladium, and they made the Megaversal system, and nobody called it that, apparently. I saw, like, Heroes Unlimited I played, the original Palladium game I played, but I was looking at it, and they also had a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game, which I now have to find. I would love to play that. And they had a Robotech game using the same system. That sounds great.
I think I had played the Robotech game, and I definitely played Heroes Unlimited, which has some of the flair from the because they're mechs in Heroes Unlimited. And then if you go into Rifts, which we'll get into that one later, I'm sure, but it's all the same sort of thing. But no, it was an interesting system. Again, you'll start to see that as these systems. You start to hear about some of the rule sets for these systems. That's what sort of bore some of the current modern day MMORPGs, like the way the characters are designed. Also, all these systems are the inception of any sort of role playing game that you play, like on your computer or whatever else like that you have. So these are integral to how those games came to be.
Yeah, point-buy systems, different types of armor, different types of saving throws, skill checks, and stuff like this. While Dungeons and Dragons came up with a genre and sort of developed some of the core ideas based off of wargaming, sort of building on things, these other systems came out with, interesting new ways to do stuff. And it became adopted by other systems. It got adopted by other types of games. Like you said, video games were a big part of this. And some of these things came back into and merged with other games. And a lot of the modern games we see have these long histories dating back 40, 50 years. And we can learn a lot by taking a look at some of these old systems. Now, I've got another section in here, and I do want to put a little warning out before we talk about this, because we do talk about suicide. In the 1980s, starting back in 1981, there was something, lasted up into the 90s, sort of died out by the 90s, but still existed, was something we refer to as the Satanic Panic. Now, Satanic Panic was originally because somebody wrote a book about a child who was inhabited by Satan. I don't know. It seems really weird to think about nowadays, but back then it was a big deal. You had movies like Rosemary's Baby. You had The Omen. And one of the first things that sort of tied it into role-playing was a book called Mazes and Monsters. Mazes and Monsters was a fiction book from 1981 that was made into a made-for-TV movie starring Tom Hanks in 1983. But it is actually based on the real-life suicide made by a D&D player. I think he may have actually been doing LARP. He was depressed. He had a lot of issues and had no support. And it's not uncommon for people that are on the outside of society, conceptually, to be drawn into tabletop role-playing games. I know a lot of us, we find escapism in that the genre has become more accepting and open and accessible. And it wasn't back then. So you had a depressed, suicidal person that ended up doing so and tying it back into video games because it happened. I think he was seen at Gen Con when this the day that it happened anyway. So there was investigation at this gaming convention. He was listed as a D&D player, and suddenly it became a Dungeons and Dragons issue rather than a person with some severe depression without any support. And unfortunately, that sort of led into other things. There was a woman who made a campaign against D&D after her son died by suicide. And it was a one-woman campaign, and she formed a whole organization called BAD, or Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. it was such a big deal. They actually had a episode on 60 Minutes about this, and they interviewed her, and they interviewed some preachers about Satan, and they had Gary Gygax on there, and I've got a quote from him. Gygax said, and I quote, "This is make-believe. No one is martyred. There is no violence here. To use an analogy with another game, who is bankrupted by a game of Monopoly? Nobody is. The money isn't real. There's no link, except perhaps in the mind of those people who are looking desperately for any cause other than their own failure as parents." Unfortunately, because of all this stress, because of all the press, because of all the issues that were going on, TSR ended up removing demons, devils, and other things when they created Second Ed. So you had such a public pressure about, the satanic panic that it actually changed what was available for people to play in game.
Yeah, yeah, I never heard that quote. But that's a very interesting quote. Good analogy. No, but these were formative things. I feel like anybody who had played Dungeons and Dragons or any sort of role playing game in this time, if you picked up the games in the '90s, which is where we're going to next, you're gonna realize that you probably, it wasn't a cool hobby, or it wasn't a hobby that a lot of people talked about like it is today. And we're kind of gonna see that as we go forward in this system. And obviously, the Satanic Panic did have a major impact on the game systems and the game and the hobby as a whole back then. But again, mostly of what your era was about here was trying to refine your systems and create, universal game systems. And you can see that in just the explosion, the number of types of game systems that arose in the decade there. And so now we go on to the 90s, and we're going to try to go a little bit quicker through some of these because we've been rambling on and on and on.
Oh yeah, I told you this could go forever. I want to hit real quick. We had talked about games, specifically video games, and the 90s were a big part of that. One of the original D&D had their first licensed game using something called Goldbox. It came out in '88 on the PC, but by the time it got into Nintendo and it had a wider audience, was 1992. And there was a lot of these Goldbox games. The other thing that you want to take a look at also that really started taking off in the 90s was the MUDs, the multi-user dungeons. Now, MUDs were not new. MUDs existed back as early as the late 70s, which is difficult for me to concept because, who had a PC and a net connection back then? You didn't. There was no internet. There was BBSs, or there was you worked at a place with a server and you connect with the terminal. And that's how they had some of those. But it was when you had, the late 80s with the BBSs and the 90s that you started seeing this. One of the first real big ones was Neverwinter Nights back in 1991. And that's straight up D&D. I think the 90s really encapsulated the rise of the narrative games. Okay, you had modules for Second Ed like Spelljammer and Ravenloft and Planescape. And these were heavily stylized campaigns in in heavily stylized worlds. And then, of course, you got White Wolf.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, White Wolf. Again, this is the system that I know near and dear. This is the era and when we actually jumped into it. And again, we started off in the second ed of White Wolf. I don't even know what the first ed was like, but it brought in the concept of the vampire, the mages, and the werewolves, and trying to that trinity of styles there. And the interesting thing with the White Wolf system is known as the storyteller system, which fits very much in line with the rise of these narrative games. Josh would know where the dice system came from for it.
The
It was
D10s?
The D10s, yeah.
The D10s were actually part and parcel with the percentile dice, but they switched out, 2 dice for an over-under system that was more in tune with. We're gonna have to go back here and take a look.
That's all right.
I had notes.
He promises he had notes. We can add a little addendum at the end of the episode or something like that. But no, this was, I mean, again, and even today, I still see how much, storytelling we were able to do through the narrative landscape. Again, the White Wolf system is like, if you've seen the movie Underworld, I mean, that's heavily based on the White Wolf like world and like this world of the night and this,
There was a lawsuit about that, so yeah. Well, and I think the narrative games from this period of time is very interesting because while Dungeons and Dragons had to pull demons from their game because of the Satanic Panic, you saw other games sort of embrace some of those darker tones. And so, yeah, White Wolf, you had Vampire the Masquerade, you had Mage the Awakening,
the Ascension.
or the Ascension, there you go, and Werewolf Apocalypse. And you had games, 89 had Shadowrun.
Mm-hmm.
D&D Second Ed, but it was darker. It was grimier. In 1990, you had Cyberpunk 2020. There was a Cyberpunk 2013, but let's not talk about it. 2020 came out in 1990. And a lot of the games that came out during this time were a lot more about style and narration. And it wasn't as much of a sandbox or a dungeon crawl. It was very much in this, like, let's create a story. I do have notes in here about the fall of TSR. Now, TSR, game that, a company that created Dungeons and Dragons in the first place, went through a lot of changes. In the 80s, Gygax lost control of the company just before Second Ed, and there was a lot of push to sort of make it more and more profitable. And they had worked on publishing books. And you probably have seen these, the Dragonlance books, the R.A. Salvatore's Drizzt, or how do you pronounce that? How do you say Drizzt? Is it Drizzt? Whatever, it's Drizzt. And the problem was that they burned a lot of bridges also. They did like movie deals. The Dungeons and Dragons movie that came out in 2000. Do you remember that one? It was terrible. Yeah. We should watch it. It started back in the early 90s and took a decade to complete. And they also made deals with DC Comics, but then they turned around and tried to make supplement comic books on their own and tried to not sell them in comic book shops. So people didn't know what they were. But because they were making them, it made DC angry, and they canceled a bunch of comics that they were going to work on. So it just blew up in their faces in both directions. Ended up, TSR had a lot of money lost. And as part of their restructuring, they were bought by a little company called Wizards of the Coast, who was only really known for at the time by making Magic the Gathering, which TSR also tried to create their own card game system and a dice system, and those were short-lived also. But Wizards of the Coast bought the rights to TSR, and one of the things they found was they had spread themselves so thin with all these different books and supplements and other things. None of them, they were competing with themselves. And it sort of just imploded on them. So
again, stop doing what you're good at. So again, what was this era about besides the fall of TSR?
Well, it was a lot of publishers showing up and going away. There was a lot of new games that came out and they fell apart. There was sort of a decline in the tabletop gaming at this time. You had a real peak in the 80s, and the 90s sort of fell off. And there's some thought that that was because of the rise of video games. I mean, you had a lot more home systems for PCs, Nintendos, Super Nintendos, Segas, all that fun stuff. And the people that stuck with, the people that started these games, me and you, it was a lot of focus on storytelling. Storytelling was what this era was about. And because of that, I think that a lot of the tabletop role-playing games at this time really influenced video games' direction. And I think that video games influenced games, tabletop games back by, coming up with more of these single line stories, not necessarily railroady, but like more focused.
What's interesting though is here now we're going to jump into the next decade, and this is the decade that I would call like the lost decade. Like I know nothing from this decade in terms of like actual games that came out, which is interesting because I've heard of some of these, but like, I think maybe that they've been more refined in the more recent decade. So
yeah. And I've played a bunch of these games too. Like, okay, in 2000, Wizards of the Coast came out with their own version of Dungeons and Dragons. They dropped the advanced from it. It was just D&D third ed. And it was a simplified version of D&D. They balanced the classes. They balanced the races. Everybody got to 20. Max level was 20 now. And then they switched over from the old style of rolling for things. Everything was now based off of a D20. And because of all the stuff they'd seen with the fall of TSR about, overextending themselves, writing too many books, putting out too much effort to sort of supplements after supplements after supplements, they went and they created the OGL. And the OGL, that open gaming license, allowed anybody to go and create role-playing stuff under this license. And if it worked for D&D, then it worked for D&D. And they could have other people provide all these extra supplements without hurting the profitability of the core materials. And I think this was a real big step forward because it really opened up the genre for indies, for anybody to come in and create something. And yeah, you get a little bit more without this, Dungeons and Dragons would not have the sheer market size that it does now, because you allowed anybody to become a publisher for Dungeons and Dragons. It became the place to do things. Now, D20, the D20 system and the OGL, because you had this open gaming license and the concept, allowed them to come out with other games that use the D20 or use that concept. And so you had like D20 Modern, Mutants and Masterminds, Pathfinder. These were all games that came out under that same sort of license. And third ed was also important because, it added some of those those things that had been lost in second ed back in, specifically demons, but also like monks and some other stuff. But 3 was a little unbalanced. And so they came out with 3.5 in 2003, just 3 years later, more balance. Other things were added back in there. New options, new spells, and it was pretty good. I played 3.5, but only like 4 years later they came out with fourth ed, and I don't think that went over really
anybody.
Well. Like, I know people that like it, but not because it was a good Dungeons and Dragons game. It's because when you play fourth ed, it is everyone's a hero. Everyone's got, big changes, abilities, powers. There's a lot going on. Some people say it's very video gamey, because you've got a lot of things you can do. There's some fun stuff that came out in there, stuff that we still use, short rests, came out from fourth ed. But they also had things bloodied. I use it. I like bloodied. I like the concept of, you know, partway through a fight, you get like a little boost to your bad guys, makes fights more interesting to me. It's a thing. Which is why I was looking back at these old games, is because we can learn stuff from parts of the games that have been lost to time. But like I said, 2000s were, because of the OGL, because you had this indie boom, other games came out. Ever heard of Fudge?
I know the Fudge system, and again, that's what Fate was built on. The game I played, God, I'm blanking on it right here. The whole live play we did with Devil Went Down in Jersey was built on the Fudge system. Again, it's a D6 system. It's you know, it's been around.
Yeah. And, you know, it's systems built on systems built on systems. Another big part of the 2000s in video games, we're talking about mass mugs.
Yeah.
Talking about those massive multiplayer online role-playing games.
Yeah, you got Ultima, EverQuest, RuneScape, Final Fantasy XI, World of Warcraft, D&D Online. And now the truth is, World of Warcraft is what is unto D&D. Like they represent the two biggest players in their respective spaces, and you'll see that as we go forward here. That, you know, we'll get to that in the retrospective. We got one more decade to go. So what was this decade about, Josh?
This decade was about. It was a lot about simplification. They took, you know, overly complicated, a lot of books, a lot of rules, a lot of options, and, you know, dumb it down, make it easy, make it accessible. And that's part of, you know, also the thing that happened with the video games was that they took these systems that had been out there and they made them accessible. They put them in a nice shiny package that was easy to get into and delivered them to people in new ways. It opened up the system, it opened up the genre, and it brought people into the hobby in ways that were unexpected and brought a lot of people in. Yeah, there weren't, you talk about, you know, like a missing decade, but it really is sort of a rebirth. And a lot of what we see today is because this happened.
Yes. And that's when we get into the 2010s to now. And this has really been kind of the revival. Like, again, had you not had the Satanic Panic back then, it had the hobby not been branded in such a way that it was for like outcasts and people of that nature, you probably would end up where you are right now with D&D 5th Ed, which, you know, when D&D 5th Ed came out, you know, that's the edition that everybody's currently using today. And, you know, they're gonna move on from it because, you know, there's money in them Thar Hills. But 5th Ed really revived the hobby as a whole. Like, again, when people are playing Dungeons and Dragons, even people who played like 2nd Ed, you know, AD&D, stuff like that, this is the edition that brought people more in line with everything. From everything I know, it completely resimplified everything. It made things, you know, went back to, somebody described it, rules light, role play heavy. Like, it kind of re-entered that core of where the games started.
Yeah. And I think how it came out in the first place is very important also, is that D&D 5th Ed was, because of the issues they had with 4th Ed, what they did was they had an open play test. I was even a part of this open play test. You could just sign up and you could get the supplements, the little books, the PDFs online that gave you the core rules of the game. Some of the basics, like the basic set back from the early 80s, where you'd have your first couple of levels in a PDF that you could see and play. And they called it D&D Next. And it played really well. And it played really easy. And you could just get a free copy of it from the company and play it and see if it's any good. And then they release the books and you're like, yes, I love this. And part of that also was some of those early sets, your starter set. They came out with those boxes again that were the simple set with a story, and you could jump right into it. Lost Mines of Phandelver is just an excellent starting place for learning to play D&D. And that also kind of ties in with the virtual tabletops. Fantasy Grounds came out in 2004, but it didn't get Dungeons and Dragons until 2015. Roll20 came out in 2012, and they got D&D in 2015 also. And in 2016, Roll20 got that Lost Mines of Phandelver with the 5th Ed. When it all was released, it was available online with that virtual tabletop. So you didn't have to find a table. You didn't have to drive to somebody's house. You could just log in and play your game in a browser. It's crazy, right? Now, there are other games that came out in the past couple of years that are really good, and I've played some of these, and others I haven't. Two of the ones I wanted to look at was the Powered by the Apocalypse system. Apocalypse World is in there. There's a couple other games that are in there that are really good. It's not a universal system, but it is open enough to spawn games of different genres. Very stylized, unique actions, consequences. There's been 30 different games made using the system since 2010. 30 of them. Look them up. Wow. Some of them really, really fun. Another one that I thought you might like, Aaron. I don't know if you heard of this as Gumshoe.
I think I have heard the Gumshoe system. At least I think the part of it that Jared took away from it was the iceberg style of building a mystery. I think I had heard of it. Or maybe he was using something else. But either way, maybe he was inspired by Gumshoe. But this one's more focused on investigations, obviously by the name Gumshoe. Again,
I think what was really nice about when I read about this was that it wasn't so much on finding clues in your investigation. You just get the clues. The rolling and the figuring out was about interpreting them and sort of building a story off of that, so that it was more interesting on how you'd solve things rather than trying to find a clue. You don't have to worry about a player missing a clue. You just have to worry about them not understanding what the hell it means. Another thing I liked about it was that it is a point-buy system, but the pool of points shrinks the more people are in the game.
That makes sense. Because you're trying to then limit, you don't want everybody just to be the jack of all trades. You need people to be more in specialized in what they do. So it's a team building exercise.
It's a cooperative play, which is something I think that, modern Dungeons and Dragons is sort of lacking, is that, everybody's a hero, which means that there's less teamwork. Well, Gumshoe has made 14 games since creation, so there's a lot to be unpacked there as well. So what do you think this era is about, Aaron?
Well, Josh, it's about refinement and simplicity. I think you kind of see that in the D&D, although D&D 5th Ed arguably now has gotten more complex. But that's what happens with every game as you keep going, and that's why you're going to end up with a different edition, because they're going to redo it in some way. Marketing, and then this is access and saturation. This is the decade that brought it into the mainstream. You've got Hollywood actors playing. You've got people talking about openly. You've got the Twitch making it more popular for live plays, all sorts of different things. So, I mean, this is really what this whole, again, this is truly the revival of the game itself. So, again, we sort of talked about all of these as we went through, but what can we learn from each era? Well, we're going to surmise them right now. So there's obviously the beginning back in the 70s that talks about, like where they came from with war games, the popularity, how they made them popular, how they defined things, how they defined the rules, even though they were vague, and the types of games that were built off of them. And then because it was a popular thing. He was the first to do it. Copy what's good for you. If it's good for one person, it's probably good for others. You get to the next section, which is the growth of the system.
Yeah, and as the popularity grew, late 70s, early 80s, into that big boom, so did rules, so did options, so did supplements. They get a lot of stuff in there. Systems got complicated. There's new systems that came out, universal systems. They tried to simplify things to help players and GMs learn, but there's so many things that went on. And you had options to try existing rules or make up your own. And there was a lot of throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. And eventually it became a little overburdened. And that's where we got to the decline. And that's when, the new technology, like I said, video games, oversaturation of the market, too many supplements, slowed down, killed the big publishers.
Stigma around the games. I mean, it's just all sorts of things that did it.
And new publishers came to prominence at the time. That's where you get the White Wolf. That's where you get the WotC. You ended up moving from an action standpoint to a more narrative style of gameplay, which is a lot of fun. More and more focus was placed on style also. You get a lot of these games that are very stylistic. And I think this is the era that video games became a real entry point for people into the genre, actually. You could go and pick up a copy of Baldur's Gate for your PC, and then you're like, oh man, this would be really fun if I had a lot of people to play with.
And then you come back to the revival, and we talked about this goes from the 2000s on. I don't know, Josh. I don't think that's right. I guess that started because of the OGL, and so that's where you're claiming the start of the revival was. But I mean, it really caught steam and really connected with everything when you hit that fifth ed starting point, and that just bounced everything off. And I think that's when you start getting to what modern games are, and seeing it everywhere. I mean, like you mentioned it in Stranger Things. It's in Hollywood. Even people are going back to the older games now. There's so much more talking about it. And your little final piece that you had added in here was about you could do an online session with the global pandemic. Yeah, I guess getting bored of Jack in the Box games. You didn't like our nights doing Jack in the Box games, and
I love that. I still have all of them. No, it's fine. It's one of those things like, hey, you got options, and because VTTs are a thing, because you can go out and just get like PDFs of games and play them online, we can do this thing where I don't have to record in session, and that is a real boon to the hobby. Is you don't have to be in the same place. One of the people we game with on Tuesday doesn't even live in the same state as us. Still's online every week, so that's nice. So, where is this going? We've looked at the past. Can we look to the future?
Well, again, where is it going? And again, you got them divided into the good, the bad, the ugly. I'll give you my little 2 cents on where this is going, and then you can fill in your thoughts, Josh. Okay, you've been talking a lot this episode.
I'll do that.
So I think obviously we talked about it when we did the review of 1D&D. This is going in the direction of story first, rolling light in the game. That is what I'm seeing with every new role playing system that I've gotten my hands on, that Jared has brought in. He is trying to incorporate that in our current game, and you can again see that there because the roles need to mean something in a game. And now that they're adding the options to failure on any roll, which is what a lot of games do, is there's a failing point on any roll. You want to then say, I want you to narratively describe to me what you're doing, and then we will decide whether or not a roll is necessary based upon your skill set. So I think there's less rolling in the future of the role-playing game, which is good. I mean, it is a role that you are playing in a game, not that you are rolling dice in a game. The ugly for me is that the one place where innovation should happen, and it has gotten significantly worse, is combat. Okay. And combat is just like, there is no good innovation in combat that I have seen. Like, speeding up combat is something that we have tackled on this podcast multiple times. And I don't think that any system has quite figured out a way to streamline and make combat effective.
No. Well, there's some systems that do away with combat because they're, more story based, or they're more we talked about the one system we talked about this with the Jenga tower, and you pull the things and you have like a love romance. Yeah. So there's games out that are trying to do a no combat or low combat system, but innovation in that area is still dicey. No pun intended there. My good and bad and ugly for this, the good thing, if you look back at all the decades, all the different eras, every iteration takes things that worked from before, all the supplements, every little bit and piece, and sort of refines them, makes them more accessible, brings things that we liked, and makes them core features. Things that, were supplemental or experiments are now cornerstones of games. And some of these ideas have endured for 50 years. Part of that, though, is part of the bad, is that every time you have a new iteration, to make it new, it's going to try and do new things. Some of those things are good. Some of those things are bad. There's going to be pitfalls. There's going to things that hinder gameplay or just anger players, because change is change and not everybody likes change. It's not to say that making people happy is the best thing for the genre. Even us, even the mighty GMs, we shouldn't always be happy with what we're getting. I think if you're happy, then you're not innovating. You're not trying new things. You're just taking what they give you. You need to experience what the bad is to understand what the good is. The ugly here, I think that the ugly I'm seeing is innovation is happening not at the forefront. In the past, Dungeons & Dragons sort of led the way with a lot of its core rules, and it sort of leads the genre. But innovation isn't synonymous with making money with a mass market. You have things that are refined to a crystal clear, easily digestible palette. And we saw this, I don't know if anybody's seen this. We might talk about this later. D&D had their virtual tabletop sort of expose just the other day for us. And a lot of what was there was very shiny, very, very shiny. But there wasn't a lot of substance to it. And yes, I think that they are trying to do something about combat, make combat easier, because they're making it a video game where you just click on the thing and it does it for you. And I don't think that's a great innovation for combat either. Yeah, combat's slow, combat's difficult, but I like the options. I like the storytelling. I like the concepts, people coming up with new things, because really a lot of what we do with tabletop games, a lot of what we've been doing for 50 years has been trying new things and seeing what works rather than just clicking the button.
Yep. Exactly.
Do we do predictions on this?
Okay, so if you want to do predictions, Josh, we can come back in 200 episodes and see if we're right about any of these things.
Ooh.
So
I'm game. Are you game?
I'm game. I'm game, yeah.
All right. What do you got here? Okay. I think even with all the fuss and trouble about the OGL recently, D&D is still going to be the top dog. Started the whole thing. It's going to stay a leader of the hobby.
I think that's 100% correct.
Yep, I'm going out on a limb here. This is a hot take.
Oh boy, yeah, you're really come up with some really heavy hitting predictions here.
Well, I want to start on something that I'm going to get right later. Okay. I mean, it would be really fun if I'm wrong. I'd really, find it interesting. Somebody else comes up and takes that place, because I think that would be a real shakeup to the whole thing. And like I said, playtesting in the community produces a safer product, but it's not necessarily innovative. And other companies may be able to use that gap to step forward.
I think if anything's going to usurp D&D, it's going to have to take what it's done and do it again. It really depends on where they end up going with their new VTT and stuff, and the direction of the company, because you could see, like, some of the bigger players in the space who are streaming the games switch to another system or design their own, and that would be a real blow unto D&D. So, yeah, but I think that it's a pretty safe bet to say that they're going to reign as top dog. They might not have as big of a market share, because I think the desire for a bigger space, and the desire for more is out there, but we'll come to see what happens. So,
yeah. Next hot take.
Hot take.
Hot take. I think that small publishers are going to get more and more players. I think that they're going to get a larger market share. Specifically games like Paizo's Pathfinder and these other games that are, there's a lot of space for new systems. People want to try new things. They've played Fifth Ed, they've tried that. They want to see what other options there are. And maybe they don't like the D&D or the VTT or whatnot. They want to try something different. And GMs may go in, we're going to run this game instead. And I think you're going to get a lot more push into some of these other games, and some of them are going to get, you're going to have revivals of some of the older systems, and you're going to have some more publication of the newer systems that may not have the same market share they currently do, but they're going to grow. I think they're going to pull things from indie publishers, and that's where you're going to see a lot of the innovation happening.
Yes, and I think the D&D will just leach out all that innovation, which is what World of Warcraft does to other MMOs. So there is not going to be the D&D killer. Like, no, it's not going to be there. So it's just like the World of Warcraft killer isn't there. I think your next one also isn't that far off, which is, I think, just based on the popularity, indie publishers are going to spring up. You're going to get a bunch of new games. I think you're going to find a lot of really wouldn't surprise me is if you find a lot of like more of the one-page RPGs that you've shown me becoming widely popular, because they can be done in such a short period of time, and they're built for, like, we could play this as like a game at a party that that doesn't require a ton of like time investment into it. So I could see a lot of shorter games maybe popping up in that genre.
Yeah. And I would be surprised if some of these, one-page RPGs, these indie RPGs, sort of coalesce into like boxes that you could like buy, and here's a game in a box, and or like 3 or 4 different games in a box that are a party game. That's something that people could play on a board game night. And I think that having that sort of thing as an entry point for gamers, for new people, just people sitting around playing board games, having dinner, having a couple of drinks. It sounds like a great time.
Your final one, I don't even think is really a prediction. I'm not
No, that's it was just me writing stuff just to be writing stuff. I just said that, role-playing games are going to continue to use role-playing elements to help drive the idea of player agency in games that don't actually have it.
Open world games will try to be open world. Thank you, John.
But they're not. They're not. They're not.
They're not. There are two moralities in open world games. If you try to take the middle of the road one, or like a semi evil, semi light, you get nothing. That's why the role playing game on the tabletop aspect is better in that regard, because you can get more out of your aspect to your character.
Well, okay. I have like crazy thoughts also, is that if you were to develop the proper, like the Chat GPT sort of thing, you refine it, clean it up, you could have more options for interaction, but it's going to take a lot of work to get there. Eventually you're going to get more open world, more sandboxy games that have more options, that don't rely you to follow a specific narrative, that you might be able to create your own. But it's going to be a while. That's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen anytime soon. It takes a lot of effort, and there's too much money tied up in role-playing games and in video games specifically to allow for systems just to sort of take over. Ubisoft is doing a thing where they've got an AI generated storyteller that to fill in like secondary stories and like NPC dialogue and stuff like that. And people are already up in arms about it. So change like this is going to take a long time, and you're just going to stick with a lot of status quo for the time being.
Yeah. I in 200 episodes we can talk about that one, because I don't even think it's going to happen. So that's your most outlandish one. But yeah, no, that's do you got anything else you want to add to the almost hour and a half that we've been talking?
Hour and a half? That's almost like 150% of an episode.
That's weird. It's sort of like we almost planned that. No, we didn't. No, this is just way too much information that we need to go back for. And again, this could have been like a series of 7 episodes. So
easily. And you can go back and we can talk about old games, and that might be fun. Take a look at a deep dive on one of these old games, because there is a lot that you can learn from some of these old systems in how games are played and what games are trying to do. Because all of these role-playing games, these tabletop games, have always been about homebrew. It's always been about modding and taking things from different sources and learning what worked and what didn't is going to make better games. It's going to make your experience better. I might even say it would level up your gaming.
Ooh. And with that, we're going to close out this episode. If you have thoughts on the retrospective, the deep dive that we just went through, if you learned something, let us know. levelupyourgamingpodcast@gmail.com. We hope you follow us for another 50 episodes so we can give you another wonderful 50th episode and all the other episodes in between. So if you like the podcast, subscribe to the podcast on YouTube or on your favorite podcast site. Smash the like button on YouTube or share the podcast on Facebook, and recommend it to a friend, review the podcast, all that good stuff. And that's going to wrap us up for the week and for 150 episodes. Josh, thank you for joining the podcast, and we'll see you next week, folks.
Bye.